Have you ever had the feeling that something even buried is still alive? I know, it sounds crazy to say that, especially coming from someone like me who has buried over 300 people in my lifetime. But there are stories that not even the years can bury. Some graves never really close, and there is one in particular that to this day no one has been able to get close to. We buried the body as per protocol. Everything went according to schedule. The coffin was sealed. The final prayer was said. The family left with red eyes and heavy hearts. The still damp earth welcomed yet another one among so many, yet another one. But this was no ordinary case. He was buried with a ring, a strange, ancient, heavy object. I'd never seen anything like it. It had a red stone in the center that seemed to glow even under the cloudy sky, and the family was clear. That ring cannot be removed. He must be buried with it. Please, Mr. Reynolds, for everyone's sake. At the time, I thought it was just another bizarre superstition. I've seen a lot of weird things at funerals, but what happened next? It can't be explained with logic, or with faith, or with medicine. Since that day, no one has been able to get close to that grave. Animals avoid the place, tools break out of nowhere, people get sick, the earth itself seems to pulse, as if there was something down there awake, waiting. If you think this is all made up, that's fine. Skepticism is healthy, but stay with me. Because when I tell you what I saw with my own eyes that afternoon, you might think twice before walking past a grave with something forbidden buried next to it. And it wasn't just the ring that we buried that day. My name is Tom Reynolds. I work as a gravedigger at Greenwood Memorial Park, an old and remote cemetery in the city of Salem, Massachusetts. Maybe you've heard of this town because of the witches, the old stories, the trials. I don't usually listen to that kind of stuff. Most of the time, the truth is much simpler than the rumors make it seem. But there are days when simplicity dies along with the body we bury. I've been to every kind of funeral you can imagine. Empty funerals, with only the priest and the wind for company. Funerals with a jazz band playing while the family dances as if it were a celebration. I've seen people faint over the casket. I've seen fights break out in front of the grave, promises of revenge whispered in low voices, the kind that the earth hears better than we do. But that week, something in the air was different. It wasn't just the cold or the fog that covered the graves in the morning. It was as if the cemetery itself was in a deeper silence than usual. You know, when the wind stops, the birds disappear, and even your footsteps seem to sink into the ground as if you were walking on flesh instead of stone. It was in this atmosphere that I received notification of a new burial. A man named Leonard Blake, 79 years old. The medical record said he died at home of natural causes, but there was a note from the funeral home attached to the form, handwritten, shakily. It just said, "Pay attention to the ring. Do not remove." I thought it was bizarre, of course, but you get used to eccentricities in this business. Most families want to leave a last mark, a last wish, burying someone with a hat, a favorite book, a letter. I've seen it all. But the way that warning was written, as if it were a desperate warning, it kept ringing in my head. And it was even more intense when I met his granddaughter at the wake, a young woman with dark, unblinking eyes. She came up to me and whispered, "Please, just do what he asked." That's all. The way she said it, it wasn't a request. It was almost a plea. Before I continue with this story, I need to tell you something important. On this channel, each story is more than just a scare. It's a journey, a dive into the darkest side of reality, where fear is confused with truth. And the truth is sometimes scarier than any fiction. If you feel like you no longer belong to the ordinary world, if you carry this curiosity for what lies beyond the veil of death, for stories that few dare to tell, then you are not alone. This channel is your refuge, your tribe. Here, darkness has a voice, and it wants to be heard. So, before the next scene starts, subscribe now and leave your like, because what you're about to hear will touch your soul, and you'll want to come back. The day of the burial arrived surrounded by a dense fog. the kind that seems to rise from the ground, as if the earth were exuding secrets. The sky was grey, but it wasn't raining. It was the kind of weather that makes everything heavier, as if the air was filled with memories. I arrived earlier than usual. I like to take my time preparing everything, especially when the ceremony involves large families, and from what I've heard, the Blakes had a long lineage, although few had shown up at the wake. I set up the tent, lined up the chairs, and positioned the coffin in the exact spot in the already dug grave. So far, everything was as per protocol, but there was something about the coffin that bothered me. It wasn't the way it looked. It was beautiful, well-crafted, with dark hardware and impeccable finish. It was the way it smelled, a faint metallic odor mixed with an old perfume, something that reminded me of wet wood and iron. The same kind of smell I get when I handle rusty antiques or objects that have been buried underground for a long time. The family arrived in silence. No one cried loudly, not even the granddaughter, who remained standing with her arms crossed, staring at the coffin as if waiting for him to say something. Only an elderly man, who seemed to be Leonard's brother, approached me and repeated in a hoarse voice, "The ring is on his finger. Don't take it off. Don't let anyone take it off. Ever." That repetition began to make me uncomfortable, even more so when the coffin was opened for the farewell. I saw the ring. It was exactly as I imagined, darkened gold with strange carvings and a red stone in the center that seemed to pulse under the gray light of that late afternoon. I'm not one to stare at the dead, but for some reason, at that moment, I felt Leonard's eyes fixed on me, even though they were closed. During the ceremony, the wind suddenly stopped. A deep silence fell over everyone. Not even the leaves moved. The priest began to pray, but his voice seemed muffled. The words came out, but the sound did not seem to spread throughout the room. It was as if everything was being sucked into the grave. As we lowered the coffin, one of the attendants stumbled. He said he felt something pull at his foot, but there was nothing there. The ground was firm. I looked into his eyes. They were wide and pale, as if he had seen something, but no one commented. Everything was done in silence. The shovel of dirt fell on the coffin, and soon followed the second and the third. We closed the grave. I smoothed the soil, as I always do. I crossed my arms and took a deep breath. Mission accomplished. At least that's what I thought. But that very night, something in the cemetery began to change, and the first thing was the weather. But what we buried that day was just the beginning, and what was buried didn't stay quiet for long. In the days following the burial, that ring stuck in my mind. It wasn't because of its appearance, although it was indeed disturbing. It was because of the way it seemed to have a presence of its own, as if it were pulsing on the dead man's finger. I'm not usually impressed easily. I've dealt with many strange objects buried with the deceased. Amulets, medals, letters. I've even seen a revolver once, but that ring, there was something different about it. It was as if it were alive. I started asking around quietly at the funeral home. The attendant, a young man named Greg, looked at me with some discomfort when I mentioned Blake's name. He said that his granddaughter had personally insisted on the ring, that she had even called 3 times just to confirm that he would be buried with it. She seemed scared, he said. But it wasn't about Grandpa. It was about what might happen if someone messed with that ring. It was then that I decided to investigate on my own, and what I found chilled my blood. I started at the town library, where they keep old documents about the founding families of Salem. The Blakes were there. Since the 17th century, there were records of a certain Abraham Blake, accused of witchcraft and occult practices during the witch trials, accused but never tried, disappeared before the sentence was read. There was a diary, part of the historical collection, poorly preserved but still readable. In it, one passage caught my attention. The symbol remains alive through blood. The object, sealed in red metal, must be kept close to the body. The curse is reactivated upon separation, and right next to it, hand-drawn, is the same symbol carved into Leonard's ring. a circular figure with internal branches like thorns and a red central dot. I returned to the cemetery with that diary in my hand, and the more I read, the more I felt the presence of that object growing stronger. It was as if something was awakening there. The ring was not just a family heirloom. It was a seal, an anchor, something that needed to remain buried with that body for a reason that no one dared to explain. And it was at this point that his granddaughter reappeared. She returned to the cemetery 2 days after the burial. She found me alone, near the tool shed. She was pale, shaking, as if she had seen a ghost. "He always warned me," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "Never take the ring off, never." I asked her to tell me what she knew, and what she revealed to me seemed like something out of a movie. But when I looked into her eyes, I realized it wasn't a fabrication. She said the ring had been passed down through generations, but it was never meant to be worn. It was a symbol of connection to something the family had tried to forget, an ancient promise made by someone from the past in exchange for power. Since then, every Blake who had worn it had died under strange circumstances. Leonard was the last. "If the ring is disturbed, it wakes up." She said this with a choked voice, her eyes fixed on the horizon. And before she left one last sentence which echoes in my mind to this day. "The body is buried, but what is connected to it never sleeps for long." What seemed like just a family heirloom was, in fact, a prison. And now, something down there began to stir. At first, I tried to ignore it. After all, a cemetery is not a light place. It's common to feel a heaviness in the air, especially after an emotionally charged funeral like Leonard's. But what began to happen in the following days, it didn't feel like the weight of longing. It was a different kind of presence, a presence that seemed to spread out from that grave, an invisible field, almost like a heat wave, but in reverse. Cold, dense, sticky. It all started 3 days after the burial. I went to the area where he was buried to check the drainage, since there was a forecast of rain. As soon as I got closer, I felt a strange discomfort in my chest, a kind of tightness, as if the air had thickened. I took 2 more steps and started to sweat. Even though the weather was mild, my stomach turned. It was as if something inside me was telling me times. That same afternoon, when I went to get a tool from the shed, I noticed that the door latch was stuck. I forced it, and it opened, but with a sharp crack I had never heard before. I picked up the shovel, and as I took it to the hole to level a small depression, the handle broke like it was made of glass. I had never seen wood break like that. It just snapped. I went back to the shed thinking, it was just bad luck. I picked up an old hoe. Heavy but reliable, I took 2 steps toward the hole, and a sudden gust of wind blew so hard it knocked me off balance. When I regained my footing, I realized that the sound of the wind wasn't coming from the trees. It seemed to be coming from the ground itself, from beneath the earth. Over the next few nights, the lighting system failed 3 times in a row. And the thing is, only the streetlight in front of Leonard's grave went out. The rest of the cemetery remained lit. The electricians came, changed the wiring, tested everything. Nothing worked. On their last visit, one of them jokingly said, "I think the dead don't like light." Nobody laughed. And just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, I got a call from the night janitor. "Tom, there's something wrong here." "What's wrong?" "I can't explain it, but tonight, the earth moved on its own, like it was breathing. What if I told you that even the earth has started to react, as if it were trying to warn you that something inside is still alive?" The morning after the caretaker's call, I made my way to the site with cautious steps. It wasn't raining, but the ground seemed wetter than the rest of the cemetery, and there was a low mist covering just that row of graves, as if something was trapped there, slowly evaporating. It was then that I began to notice a pattern. A detail so simple that it had gone unnoticed in the previous days, but that, once noticed, I could no longer ignore. The animals. Greenwood had always had a constant presence of cats. They were skittish, sure, but they lived there. They slept on the warmest graves, hunted small rodents near the hedges. We had crows too, lots of them. A particular group used to roost in the trees on the west wing every morning. It was almost part of the routine. But since Leonard's burial, they've all disappeared. I decided to test it out. I left some food near the hole, something cats usually don't refuse. I watched from a distance under a tree. One of the cats appeared, black, thin, and walking slowly. It approached, but when it stepped within 2 meters of the hole, it stopped suddenly. Its ears flattened, its body stiffened, and as if it had felt a shock, it turned around and ran away, letting out a shrill meow. The next day, one of the employees brought his dog, a docile Labrador, accustomed to the environment. As soon as he got close to the entrance of the row where Leonard was buried, the dog stopped. He growled at nothing. He lay down on the ground and wouldn't move any further. But it was with the crows that things got really strange. One grey afternoon, I heard a flock of birds screaming loudly, flying over the entrance to the cemetery. I climbed up to the plateau to watch. They were flying in circles, but they weren't landing. They just circled and circled, as if something there was preventing them from landing. And in the center of the imaginary circle, Leonard's grave. It was at that moment that I realized it wasn't just people who were avoiding the place. Nature itself seemed to want to stay away, as if it knew there was something there, something ancient, something that shouldn't be disturbed. When even animals avoid a place, maybe it's because they know something we don't. And what I discovered after that, it only gets worse. That week, the cemetery seemed to be acting of its own accord, as if it had become a living organism, reacting to what we buried there. I tried to rationalize, to follow the routine, to pretend that it was all just a coincidence, but events kept pushing me in another direction. On Monday, I had to go back to the West Row to repair an old headstone that had sunk slightly in the rain. I had a sledgehammer, a trowel, and a toolbox with me. As I reached the bend in the stone path and began to approach the area of Leonard's grave, I felt that tightness in my chest again. My shoulders felt heavy, as if I were carrying bags of cement. But I kept going. I chose to work on a grave 10 feet away from his, far enough away that I wouldn't have to step directly on the ground where Leonard lay. I had started to dig around the side of the headstone when the sledgehammer slipped from my hand. It didn't fall, it hurtled, as if it had been pulled. It slammed hard against the side of the headstone and cracked the corner. I knelt down to pick it up, but when I touched the handle, I felt an unnatural warmth, as if the wood had been left in the sun for hours. But it was a cold day, and the handle, it had been with me the whole time. I got up, startled. At that moment, the streetlight right above me blinked twice and went out. I looked around. The other streetlights remained lit. Only that one went out again. The next morning, the lawn tractor we'd been using for years, a simple, reliable model, just wouldn't start. The battery was new. The engine was in perfect working order, but every time we tried to start it near Leonard's Row, it would stall. Just as we got halfway across the cemetery, the engine would shut off, as if something had drained its power. And when we manually pushed the tractor away from the spot, it started again. The electrician, called for the 4th time, ran tests with more advanced equipment. On the day of the inspection, he brought a box with frequency sensors, electromagnetic fields, and other things I didn't even know existed. He said it was to test whether there was any natural interference in the place. He came out of there white as a sheet. He called me to the corner, away from the others, and said, "Look, I don't usually believe in these things, but this place has an unstable magnetic field. And the strangest thing is, it's oscillating, as if it had a pulse." I stood there digesting this as I watched the silent grave in the distance. And then, at that exact moment, I saw the streetlight flicker on again. Up until that point, most employees had already avoided that area of the cemetery. Some pretended to have forgotten their tools in other corners. Others made up excuses to avoid going near them. But there are always those who need to see it for themselves to believe it, or in this case, to pay the price. His name was Kyle. He was in his early 20s, new to the team, one of those guys who thinks everything is an exaggeration. He never believed the stories. To him, any strange stories were just an effect of the heavy environment or the power of suggestion. I liked him. He was hardworking, dedicated, but stubborn, and it was this stubbornness that led him to do what no one else had the courage to do. One Thursday morning, he arrived before anyone else. He had heard the rumors, of course. He knew about the ring, the broken tools, the streetlights going out, but I thought it was all nonsense. As we drank coffee in the little restroom, he said something that gave me chills. "If this place is really cursed, I'm going there today. I want to see this grave up close. Maybe you guys are too suggestive." I tried to dissuade him. I told him about what I felt, about the animals' reactions, about the behavior of electricity, but he laughed. He said it was just a macabre coincidence that we were turning into a legend. That day, around 10 in the morning, I saw Kyle walking alone towards Leonard's grave. Without hesitation, he stopped in front of the grave, crossed his arms, and stood there for a few minutes. I watched from a distance, behind the window of the shed. Suddenly, he crouched down. He touched the earth. He kept his hand there for a few seconds, and then he simply stood up, as if nothing had happened. He walked back slowly, without saying a word. He seemed calm, but there was something on his face, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, his eyes slightly red, as if he had seen something he still couldn't explain. He didn't want to talk to me that day. The next morning, he didn't show up for work. We got the news late in the afternoon. Kyle had had an accident at home. He fell down the basement stairs, fractured 2 ribs, and hit his head. But the strangest thing was what his mother told him when she called to let him know. She said that he had been agitated that morning. He had woken up screaming. He said that someone was calling for him from upstairs, that a voice was whispering his name insistently, but he lived alone. The doctor said he was in a state of confusion, probably because of the blow. But to this day, he refuses to talk about what happened in the cemetery. He asked to be transferred to another city. He never showed up there again. The only thing he left behind was a box with his belongings and a note stuck to the lid. Never challenge what was buried with intention. Kyle's case was the final straw. From that moment on, I realized that this was no longer just a series of strange events. There was something buried in this earth that did not belong in the natural world. And worse, it seemed to be waking up. I began to investigate on my own, without telling anyone. Not the other grave diggers, not the caretaker, not the funeral home. The last thing I wanted was to spread panic. I needed to understand the origin of that ring, and everything indicated that the Blake family's past hid more than old documents and local rumors. I went back to the Salem Public Library, but this time, I went beyond the family archives. I asked for access to the reserved historical collection, where the less popular records are kept, the ones that the tour guides don't show on Halloween tours. It was there that I found a small book with a dry leather cover, without a title. There was a single worn inscription inside, the lineage of the bond. The name Blake appeared dozens of times in the first few pages, and right there in one of the opening chapters, I found a direct mention of the symbol of the ring, described as mark of covenant with the spirit of the sealed land. The text was dense, written in archaic English, but it made one thing clear. This family had made a pact. Centuries ago, an ancestor, the same Abraham Blake who appeared in the records of the witch trials, had performed a binding ritual with an entity known only as the Watcher. The goal was to provide protection and prosperity for the bloodline in exchange for eternal loyalty. The anchor of this pact was the ring, and according to the manuscript, it could not be separated from the bloodline without releasing what was contained within. The feeling that I was dealing with something that should never have been unearthed began to overwhelm me. This was no legend. It was a prison, a seal, and Leonard Blake had been the last in the line to bear that burden. I left the library with a queasy feeling in my stomach. The clouds seemed to be lower that day, and when I got back to the cemetery, the wind carried a strong smell of wet earth, even though it hadn't rained. I went straight to the shed, where I had hidden the book among old boxes of burial records. But before I closed the lid, I found something unexpected. In the bottom corner of one of the last pages, there was a handwritten notice, scrawled hastily, as if someone had written it in the dark. If the ring is buried with the last of its blood, the seal holds, but if it is disturbed, the ground will cease to be silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned in bed, listening to the creaking of the house as if each sound carried an intention. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, made me hold my breath for a few seconds. The warning at the end of the diary, short, direct, threatening, wouldn't leave my head. The ground will no longer be silent. If the ring were disturbed, if there were any interference, whatever was contained there would not remain in place. I began to mentally review everything we did during the burial, every gesture, every movement. Had someone accidentally touched the ring? Had the lid of the coffin really been sealed as it should have been? What if the wood inside had given way, allowing some kind of direct contact? Had we, without realizing it, broken some part of that ancient ritual? I tried to ignore these thoughts during breakfast, but my body wouldn't respond. The smell of coffee seemed distant. My hand trembled slightly. A strange nausea rose in my throat. It was as if my own body was warning me that something had escaped, that something had gotten loose. The next morning, I sat with two of the older gravediggers who hadn't yet filed for removal. One of them, Jimmy, was pale, with circles under his eyes so deep they looked like bruises. The other, Marcos, was chain-smoking, not saying a word. They both looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and guilt. It was Jimmy who broke the silence. "There's something wrong here, Tom. We can feel it. Everyone can. It's not just superstition. It's like we've buried something that's still conscious." He used exactly that word, conscious, and it fell upon us like a sentence. I was silent for a while, staring at the tools hanging on the wall of the shed. Then I answered, "I know. And maybe the problem wasn't burying it. Maybe the mistake was allowing it to manifest itself, because this place, this malaise, wasn't here before. We brought it to the surface. The grave was dug, but what went in there didn't stay quiet." Marcos stood up, threw his cigarette on the floor, and said in a low voice, as if confessing a sin, "When I threw the first shovelful of dirt, I felt like something was writhing down there, like the coffin had moved." No one said anything after that. The silence between us was more eloquent than any sentence. There was nothing to justify it. And deep down, we all felt the same thing. We were accomplices, not by will, but by ignorance, by following protocol, as we always did, without knowing that that ceremony was different. That land now had another density, another type of memory. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the sense of responsibility, the weight of having been part of something that should never have happened. It wasn't just Leonard's body that we had buried, it was a whole thing, an energy, a living memory, nourished by centuries of silence and repetition. And this guilt, it didn't come from outside, it came from within, from every gesture we made mechanically, from every time we ignored a sign, from every nervous laugh when the streetlights flickered, when the animals ran away, when the tools broke by themselves. That night, while I was sorting through the records in the shed, I found an unmarked envelope. It was hidden among the old forms, near the cabinet where we keep the death certificates. Inside was a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting. The ink faded as if it had been dampened by the weather. "He's still in prison, but he's listening." My heart almost stopped. The note had no signature. It had no date, but it seemed to be addressed to me, that knew about me. I sat on the floor for a few minutes, trying to process it. I tried to think logically. It could have been left there by someone in the family, maybe by the granddaughter, maybe even by Leonard before he died. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more I felt that sentence piercing through my deepest layers. It was like a warning and a threat. The next morning, Jimmy didn't show up. He called to say he wasn't coming back, that he'd dreamed about the open grave, that he'd woken up screaming, and that when he turned on the light in his room, the bathroom mirror was all steamed up with a handprint in the center. "I don't want to hear about this anymore," he said. "I just want distance." Marco stayed a few more days, but he began to work in complete silence. He avoided Leonard's area. He refused to do anything near it. When I asked him to help me replace the safety boards around the grave, he simply looked at me and said, "Tom, you're a good man, but this hole isn't yours to take care of anymore. It's already taken." That was the last time he worked there. 2 days later, he quit. And me? I stayed, because maybe, on some unconscious level, I knew it was too late to run. Whatever was buried there had already seen me. It had already called me. It had already whispered my name in the middle of the night. I was part of it now. I began to have recurring dreams. Nights when the cemetery appeared empty, but I could hear muffled breathing beneath the earth, damp sounds, moans, a hoarse, distant cry. And at the end, always the same scenario, me standing in front of Leonard's grave and the cross upside down. The weight of guilt is not light, it is not noisy, it does not scream, it does not bleed, it does not run. It settles in like mold, like a dense dust that covers everything without haste. And little by little, without us noticing, we stop sleeping, we stop laughing, we stop feeling our name as something ours, because after that burial, my name no longer belongs to me completely. And since that night, I've been sure of one thing. It wasn't just a man we buried that day. It was a portal, and we were the hands that closed the door from the outside, or we think we closed. That night, the cemetery seemed to breathe, a slow, deep, muffled breath beneath the earth, the kind of silence that brings not peace, but rather a sickening anticipation. It was as if the air were waiting for something to happen, as if every headstone, every grave, every cross embedded in the earth was stuck in a state of vigil, waiting for a sign. I returned to Greenwood after midnight. It wasn't my shift, but something kept pushing me there. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was guilt, maybe that voice of Leonard's granddaughter still echoing in my mind, reminding me that the body is buried, but what is attached to it never sleeps for long. I took with me a flashlight, my old winter coat, and a suffocating feeling in my chest, as if I were going to trial for something I don't even know if I'd committed. As I passed through the main gate, I noticed that the fog was thicker than usual. And the strange thing was that it didn't cover the entire cemetery. It was localized, concentrated exactly in the row where Leonard was buried. That part seemed isolated from the world. No sound came from there. No wind blew. Just a dense silence, as if every particle of air had been forcibly removed from there. The fog moved strangely, as if it had a will of its own. It didn't flow with the wind. It didn't dissipate with the light. It was thick, alive, dancing in slow spirals that broke and reformed like fingers reaching for something or someone. I walked slowly, my eyes fixed on the ground and my heart racing. The flashlight began to fail as I approached. First it would flicker, then it would go out completely. I hit it with the palm of my hand, shook it, nothing. I kept the light on my phone on for a few seconds until it froze. The screen froze, vibrating non-stop. I had to turn it off by force. The darkness seemed to swallow me. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint, drawn out, coming from the center of the fog. "Reynolds!" It was my name. It was whispered in a voice that seemed to come from inside my head and from the air at the same time. It was as if the earth was calling my name. A wet, hissing sound, familiar and at the same time completely inhuman. I stopped. Immediately, I felt my spine go cold. My muscles stiffened as if I had been electrocuted in the heart. I looked around, trying to find some rational explanation. But there was nothing. Only graves, fog, and that suffocating silence that seemed to crush me. I took a step back and stepped on something. When I bent down to look, I realized it was one of the motion sensors the janitor had installed. It was lit up, activated, but no one, other than me, was there. Still, it blinked, as if something was moving, something invisible, something that was moving along with me. I looked at Leonard's grave, and that's when I saw it. The ground wasn't like it had been last time. It was deeper, as if someone or something had dug into it. There were cracks in the sides, exposed roots, tiny bubbles of air rising from the surface. The ground was breathing. It swelled and gave way like a chest about to cough. The cross that marked the spot was crooked, as if it had been pushed in from the inside. A tension was taking hold of me. Not fear, but an unsettling certainty that something here no longer belonged to the world of the dead or the living. And then, without wind, without visible movement, the cross fell, all by itself. It toppled forward, as if pushed by invisible hands, landing with a dry, heavy sound that echoed through the cemetery like a muffled gunshot. I stood still for a few seconds, not knowing whether to run or pray, but something told me not to turn my back. I backed, away slowly, feeling the cold air rush up my legs. I felt a sting in my eyes. The fog seemed to burn. When I managed to get away and get close to the shed, I looked one last time at the row of graves. And I swear, by all that is holy, I saw a silhouette. It wasn't a person, it was shorter, hunched over. It stood exactly where the cross had fallen, motionless, shrouded in the mist that was now rising like thick smoke, covering everything around it. The figure didn't seem solid. It was like a figure that trembled in the air, floating a few inches above the ground, with long arms and an obscured face. I couldn't see any eyes, but I felt like I was being watched. The figure stood there for a few seconds, then it disappeared, as if it had dissolved into thin air, and with it, the mist began to dissipate, slowly, as if it had served its purpose. The next morning, we reviewed the security camera footage. One of the cameras, positioned higher up, captured the exact moment the cross fell. We saw the movement of the wood falling, with no one around, but what caught everyone's attention was another detail. For 3 seconds, a figure appeared before the lens, quick, flickering, but visible, and in the lower corner of the screen, embedded in the image like an impossible accident, there was a hand emerging from the earth, a thin hand with long, wrinkled fingers, and it was wearing the ring. The image froze on the monitor screen. No one moved. The janitor took off his glasses. The security technician cleared his throat, trying to hide his discomfort, but no one said a word, because everyone saw it. That hand wasn't from a decaying body. It was a living hand, and it was trying to get out. That night, I walked home in silence, but silence followed me. In the mirror, I felt as if someone was behind me. In the walls, I heard soft knocks on the pillow, the smell of wet earth. And ever since, on nights like that, I hear the whisper, always the same one, Reynolds. And now I know what we buried was not contained. And the worst part is that maybe it never was. After that night, something inside me changed. And I'm not just talking about fear. I'm talking about a strange sense of connection, as if a part of what we buried had stayed with me. A kind of invisible, constant presence that doesn't manifest itself in noises or apparitions, but in silence. A silence that hangs heavy in the air, as if it's always waiting for something or someone. The video captured by the cameras was shown to a few people. The reactions were silent but eloquent. 2 people left their badges on the table and never came back. Others asked for a transfer. Even the superiors, who tried to rationalize everything with technical terms and cold explanations, changed their tone after watching the images. Because there, in that brief moment, in that hand emerging from the earth, there was a truth that no logic could erase. And yet, they left the grave untouched. Officially, that Section of the cemetery was called an area under analysis for structural recovery, but those of us who live in the area every day know that it is a containment area, a space that everyone avoids, even without admitting why. A few days ago, while I was going through old documents in my office, I came across something that chilled me. It was a yellowed envelope left on my desk with no return address, no stamp, no date. Inside was a single photograph, a black and white photograph, weathered but still legible. In it, a man in a dark suit stood over a freshly dug grave, staring straight into the camera. On his left hand, a ring, the same one. The red stone was the same. I turned the photo over, and on the back was a handwritten note, almost faded. "The bond is never broken. It just waits to be remembered." And that's why I told you this story, not out of curiosity, but as a warning. Because sometimes what we bury doesn't want rest, it wants company. If you've made it this far, take a deep breath and think carefully before forgetting this story. And if you want to continue hearing confessions that no one else has had the courage to tell, subscribe to the channel now. This was just one of many secrets that the cemetery tried to hide.